Good morning and welcome to your Farm and Home Show. I'm Kristi Shive, and this morning we're visiting with Dr. Paul Norrod. He's an extension specialist for the University of Kentucky. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning, Kristi. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being with us, Paul. And today you are going to talk to us about trauma. And that is something that many of us know all too well. Paul, how should we define trauma and how does it affect our body and overall nervous system?
Yeah, trauma is a phenomenon that's similar to stress, but trauma happens when we just experience a devastating event that's just emotionally painful and intolerable, or when we experience a physical disaster or physical life-threatening events. And an example of trauma that I think of that recently affected your area out in Warren County in Western Kentucky was the tornadoes. And that's an example. Other examples of trauma that can be life-threatening or emotionally impacting can also include losing a loved one or losing your crops or from flooding or drought or being in a motor vehicle accident, Kristi. And so unfortunately, when we experience those events, it just hard codes into our brain and our body goes through a response. And people may recall or may be familiar that our bodies are designed to survive, and that's through our sympathetic nervous system, which we call our survival system. And so when we experience trauma from that life-threatening event or that emotional devastation because of a natural disaster, the loss of a family member, or another event that we are just unable to cope with at the time, that activates our survival system. And so that survival system releases a series of chemicals and hormones in the body, Kristi, that just although they're designed to help us survive and to keep moving forward in life, it can just impair our ability to think. It can make us feel really tired, and it can just help actually hinder us from dealing with other life stressors and actually recovering from the trauma.
Now, Paul, does everyone who goes through a difficult circumstance or a natural disaster, do they all experience trauma?
No, not everyone who experiences a very difficult event like the loss of a spouse or is involved in like a motor vehicle accident or has a severe illness or goes through a natural disaster experiences trauma. The experience of trauma can differ from people. Some of those differences that impact whether we experience trauma are our support mechanisms and people around us, whether we feel socially connected to others at our church or in our association meetings or in our friend groups. Our life history impacts that as well, whether we grew up in a family that had a lot of difficulties or if we grew up in a family that was very supportive. Then the other aspect that really affects the trauma, as you know, especially in farming and rural communities, if a farmer loses and is all their crops because of flooding, they've lost all their income, right? That's just a financial disaster and it's a physiological disaster. While those things are not necessarily life-threatening, they are threatening to our well-being. They're threatening to who we are. And so, but another farmer who may have lost part of a barn or something during the tornado, for example, their resources may not have been depleted. They may not have had a total wipeout or destruction of their property. And so they still have some means to be able to go through recovery. And so it varies from person to person, depending on the extent of the event that can precipitate the trauma, the social support, and just personal resilience as well.
Paul, such great information. We are out of time for today, but you are going to join us soon as we continue our conversation on trauma. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Farm and Home Show, and we'll see you next time.